I had just regained consciousness after a stroke when my wife walked into my hospital room with a folder and a smile. "The paperwork is already handled," she said. "Your children have signed. The court has ruled." Before I could speak, 2 orderlies rolled a stretcher through the door. Less than an hour later, I was taken to a private psychiatric facility, and as the van pulled away, my wife leaned close and whispered, "The company is mine now." But she had no idea what I had already put in place, evidence that would bring all of it down. I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching, from your country or city? I'd love to know who's in this room with me. A quick note, this story contains fictional elements crafted for reflection and the lessons they carry. Names and places are imaginary, but everything this story means is absolutely worth your time. The elevator doors opened on the 40th floor at 9:58 in the morning, and I stepped out into a hallway I had walked 1,000 times before. The carpet was the same deep charcoal gray I had chosen myself in 1998. The brass light fixtures along the ceiling were the ones Margaret had picked out of a catalog. On a Sunday afternoon, sitting cross-legged on our bedroom floor with reading glasses she refused to admit she needed. Everything looked exactly as it always had, except for the photograph, where Margaret's portrait had hung for 22 years, a black and white image taken outside the original warehouse in 1987. The two of us squinting into the sun, her hand tucked into the crook of my elbow. There was now a color photograph of Eleanor. She was posed in front of the Callaway Steel logo, wearing a red dress I had never seen her put on in my presence, smiling the practiced smile of someone who had spent years perfecting it. My jaw tightened. My grip on the brass handle of my walking cane pressed until my knuckles ached, but I kept moving. Walter Gaines was the first person I saw. He was standing near the far end of the hallway, with his arms crossed over his chest, his gray work jacket, the same one he had worn the day Marcus fired him 6 months ago. When our eyes met, Walter pressed his lips together hard the way a man does when he is fighting back something too large for the moment. His chin trembled once before he steadied it. "Mr. Callaway?" He said, his voice rough at the edges, cracking slightly on my name. "Walter," I said. "Thank you for coming." He reached out and gripped my forearm with both hands, squeezing once firmly the way men of our generation say the things they cannot put into sentences. I felt his hands shaking against my sleeve. Helen Vance was standing just behind him, her posture straight and professional, as always, but her eyes were rimmed red in a way that no amount of composure could fully conceal. She had been crying before I arrived and had not quite finished. When I nodded at her, she pressed one hand flat against her sternum, as if she were trying to hold her chest together. "You have no idea," she started, then stopped herself and pressed her lips together. "You have no idea how long I have been waiting for this morning, sir." "I think I might have some idea," I told her. Thomas Briggs, who had worked the furnace floor since 1991 and had the burn scars on his left forearm to prove it, reached out as I passed and touched my arm just above the elbow. His eyes were wet and he did not try to hide it. He was a man who had given 30 years of his life to this company, who had shown up through 3 recessions and 2 restructurings and a winter when we could not heat the floor properly and the men worked in their coats. He touched my arm, and that was everything. I stopped. I looked at the people lining that hallway, 12, 15, maybe more, and the tightness in my chest expanded into something I had no name for. Something between grief and gratitude, and a fury so old it had quieted into resolve. "Let's go finish this," I said. I pushed open the doors to the 40th floor boardroom. The room was set for a closing. The long mahogany table had been arranged with fresh water glasses, leather folders, and a contract document positioned in the center with 2 pens laid side by side. The Pittsburgh skyline spread out behind floor-to-ceiling windows, the Monongahela River catching the December light below. A representative from Hargrove Capital, the firm that believed it was about to acquire Callaway Steel for $340 million, sat at the far end of the table in a charcoal suit, his briefcase open in front of him. Eleanor was standing near the window. She was wearing the red dress, the same one from the photograph in the hallway. Marcus was beside her, his hand resting on the back of a chair, his MBA-polished posture arranged into an expression of easy authority. He had his father's height, or rather the height of whatever man Eleanor had chosen before she found me, and he wore it like a costume. Neither of them heard me enter. It was Eleanor who turned first. The color left her face so quickly it was almost clinical to watch, like a tide going out in a matter of seconds. Her lips parted. She reached out and gripped the back of the nearest chair, her knuckles whitening around the leather. Marcus turned a half-second later. The pen he had been holding dropped from his fingers and struck the table with a sound that seemed far too loud for the size of the object. The Hargrove Capital representative looked between us with the expression of a man who had just realized he had walked into something that had nothing to do with him. I walked to the head of the table. I set my cane against the armrest of the chairman's chair. I sat down. The leather was familiar under my hands. This was my chair. It had always been my chair. I looked at Eleanor. I looked at Marcus. I looked at the contract sitting on the table between us with its 2 waiting pens. Then I looked at the door behind me where Raymond Clark had entered, quietly, followed by Agent Patricia Cole of the FBI Pittsburgh Field Office, followed by Thaddeus Gray, who was in a wheelchair, but sitting in it the way a man sits when the wheelchair is temporary, and he intends to make that clear to everyone in the room. Eleanor made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when the ground beneath them disappears. I said, that someone was selling my company. The room had no answer for that. So I continued. Before anyone picks up either of those pens, I think there are a few things this room needs to see. Raymond nodded once toward the audio-visual panel on the wall. The large screen behind me, the one that had been loaded with Hargrove Capital's acquisition, slides flickered and changed. What appeared instead made Eleanor's grip on the chair tighten until her whole arm was shaking. But to understand why this morning matters, I said, addressing the room, addressing no one, addressing Margaret somewhere beyond the December sky outside these windows. You need to understand where it started and how long the road back has been. The year was 1985, and the building I now call the Callaway Steel headquarters was not yet a building at all. It was a rented warehouse on the south side of Pittsburgh, 3 blocks from the Monongahela River, with a corrugated tin roof that leaked in 2 places when it rained, and a loading dock that listed slightly to the left, because the previous tenant had backed a forklift into the support beam and never reported it. I was 30 years old. I had $11,000 in a checking account, a used pickup truck with a cracked windshield, and a business plan I had typed on Margaret's typewriter over the course of 4 weekends because I could not afford a word processor. Margaret had read every page of that plan, twice. She had circled things in red pen, not errors but questions. Things like, how will you handle delayed payment from contractors? And what is your contingency if steel prices spike in winter? She handed it back to me across the kitchen table and said, I fixed your grammar on page 7. The rest of it is good enough to bet on. We bet everything. The first year there were 3 of us. Me, Margaret, and Walter Gaines, a 27-year-old with arms like bridge cables and a handshake that made your bones shift. Walter had heard about the operation through mutual contact and showed up on a Tuesday morning with his own tools and a canvas bag, asking if we were hiring. I can't pay you yet, I told him. I was not ashamed of it, but I was not comfortable with it either. I can tell you what the plan is and what I think it's worth, but right now, I cannot put a number on a check. Walter looked around the warehouse at the leaking roof, at the second-hand equipment at the coffee maker, with the cracked carafe sitting on an overturned milk crate in the corner. Then he looked back at me with the steady, unimpressed expression of a man who had grown up with very little and knew how to identify something real underneath the roughness. I'll work the first 3 months on trust, he said. After that, we'll see where we are. He worked 11 months before I could pay him a proper wage. He never once complained. He never once showed up late. Margaret kept the books in those early years at a desk wedged between 2 filing cabinets in the back corner of the warehouse. She taught herself payroll accounting from a library book, learned the state tax filing system from a retired accountant who attended our church, and during the winters, when cash flow tightened, she transferred money from her own personal savings account to cover the payroll shortfall without telling me until 3 years later. When she finally told me, I sat down on the edge of our bed and put my face in my hands. Not from embarrassment, though there was some of that, but because the weight of what she had carried quietly for so long hit me all at once, and I did not know what to do with it except feel it fully. Don't you dare feel bad about it, she said, standing in the doorway with a dish towel over her shoulder, her voice firm but her eyes soft. It was my money, and I chose where to put it. Now get up and take me to dinner because we just closed the Henderson contract and we are celebrating. Those were the years when everything was hard and nothing was certain, and somehow, improbably, it was also the best time of my life. Julian was born in 1986, Chloe in 1989. They grew up on the edges of that warehouse, spending Saturday mornings chasing each other between the steel racks, while Margaret packed lunches at the break table, and Walter taught Julian how to identify different grades of structural steel by the color of the mill markings. Julian lost interest after 20 minutes. Chloe at age 4 pointed at a coil of rebar and asked what it was for, and when Walter explained that it went inside concrete to make buildings stronger, she nodded with a seriousness that made every adult in the room bite back a smile. By 2005, Callaway Steel occupied 3 facilities across western Pennsylvania and employed over 200 people. By 2010, we were one of the largest structural steel suppliers in the region. Margaret and I stood on the roof of the new headquarters building. On the day it opened in 2008, 5 years after we broke ground, the year Chloe turned 19, looking out over the city, and she reached over and took my hand without saying anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment did not already contain. The diagnosis came in the March of 2014, pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The oncologist at UPMC was a careful, precise man who laid out the statistics in a way that was neither cruel nor falsely kind. Margaret listened to every word with her hands folded in her lap, and when he finished, she thanked him politely and asked 2 clarifying questions about treatment timelines. On the drive home, she looked out the passenger window at the Pittsburgh skyline and said, "Well, we're going to need to get organized." That was Margaret. Even at the end, she was thinking about what needed to be done next. 8 months. That was all we had from the day of the diagnosis to the morning of November 14th, when I sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand as she took her last breath. 8 months is not enough time. It is never enough time, but we used every hour of it. On her last clear day, when she could still speak without the medication blurring her words, she turned her head toward me on the pillow and gripped my hand with a strength that surprised me. "Arthur," she said. Her voice was thin, but her eyes were sharp and fully present, the same eyes that had read my business plan with a red pen 30 years ago. "Don't let them take what we built, not the company, not yourself. Promise me." "I promise," I told her. I meant it then. I would spend the next 6 years learning exactly how hard a promise like that could be to keep. The warehouse on the south side of Pittsburgh, where it all began, was still standing in 2014. I drove past it the evening after Margaret's funeral alone in my car in my funeral suit and sat in the parking lot across the street for a long time. The roof had been repaired. Someone had painted the loading dock. The leftward list was gone. I sat there until the streetlights came on. Then I drove home to a house that had never felt so large and so empty in all the years we had lived in it. 3 years later, I met Eleanor. The charity event was held on a Thursday evening in February of 2017 at the Omni William Penn Hotel in the grand ballroom with the gilded ceiling and the chandeliers that Margaret had always called aggressively optimistic. It was a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, an organization we had supported for over a decade, and I attended because Margaret would have wanted me to, and because Raymond Clark had called 3 times that week, reminding me that I had not left the house for anything other than work in 4 months. "You are turning into furniture, Arthur," Raymond had said on the 3rd call, his voice carrying the particular blend of affection and exasperation that only a man who has known you for 40 years can produce. "Expensive furniture, granted, but furniture nonetheless. Go to the dinner." So I went. I was standing near the bar with a glass of sparkling water. I had not touched alcohol since Margaret's last hospitalization. A private decision I had made and never discussed with anyone when Eleanor Voss introduced herself. She did not approach me the way most people did at these events. There was no calculation in her movement, no practiced pause before she spoke to give the impression of spontaneity. She simply walked up beside me, looked at the same painting on the wall. I had been looking at a landscape of the Ohio River, at dusk entirely unremarkable, and said, "That painting has been in this ballroom for at least 15 years, and I am still not sure if it's bad art or very committed mediocrity." I laughed. A real laugh, not the polite social noise I had been producing for 3 years. It surprised me enough that I turned to look at her. She was perhaps 55, with dark hair going silver at the temples that she had made no effort to conceal. She was dressed well, but not extravagantly, a deep navy dress, simple jewelry, the kind of woman who understood that elegance and expense were not the same thing. Her eyes were a clear, steady gray, and when she looked at me directly without the slightly averted gaze people had been giving me since the funeral, as though grief were something you could catch. "Eleanor Voss," she said, extending her hand. "Arthur Calloway," I said. "I know," she said. "Margaret was on our hospital board for 6 years. She was extraordinary. I am genuinely sorry for your loss." She said it plainly without the hushed tones and tilted heads I had grown to dread. She said it the way you state a true thing directly without decoration, and then she moved on, asking me about the fundraising goal for the evening, whether I thought the silent auction items were overpriced, what I thought about the new pediatric cardiac wing. We talked for 40 minutes. At no point did she ask about the company. At no point did she mention money, assets, or anything that could be reasonably described as an inventory of what I owned. She asked about a book she had seen mentioned in a speech Margaret had given to the board 2 years before the diagnosis. She asked whether I still cooked, because she had heard from someone that I used to make a very good pot roast on Sundays. I told her I had not cooked on a Sunday in 3 years. She looked at me with those clear gray eyes and said, "That seems like a waste of a skill and a Sunday." Over the following 18 months, Eleanor was a constant and unhurried presence. She did not push. She did not ask for things. She remembered that I took my coffee black without sugar, that I disliked cut flowers because Margaret had been allergic to certain pollens, and the habit of avoiding them had stayed with me, that I preferred to walk when I was thinking through a problem rather than sit still. She attended the same charity board meetings I attended. She sent books occasionally, not with notes attached, just the books themselves, which I found somehow more thoughtful than any inscription could have been. She called on Sunday mornings, not every Sunday, but enough Sundays that I began to expect it and then to look forward to it, which is its own kind of surrender. Raymond met her at a dinner in the spring of 2018, 4 months before the wedding. He shook her hand, said all the right things, and afterward walked with me to my car in the parking garage and stood with his hands in his coat pockets looking at the concrete floor. "She's remarkable, Arthur," he said. "I know," I said. "That's what worries me." He looked up then, and his eyes were serious in a way that Raymond's eyes rarely were. He was a man who had spent 50 years in law, which meant he had spent 50 years watching people present one version of themselves while concealing another. People aren't remarkable. People are complicated and contradictory and occasionally wonderful. Remarkable is a performance. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm saying pay attention. I clapped him on the shoulder. I told him he had been a lawyer too long, and it had made him suspicious of good fortune. I believed that completely when I said it. We were married in July of 2018 in a small ceremony at the Duquesne Club. 40 guests, no speeches, a lunch afterward that Margaret would have found perfectly acceptable and slightly too formal. Julian stood beside me. Chloe cried happy tears in the front row and squeezed Derek Marsh's arm so hard he winced. That night, after the guests had gone and the hotel suite was quiet, I sat in the chair by the window and looked out at Pittsburgh and felt something I had not expected to feel. Not joy exactly, but the first loosening of a tightness I had been carrying so long I had stopped noticing it. In the bathroom, Eleanor stood before the mirror. I could see her reflection from where I sat. The smile she had worn all day warm, open the smile of a woman celebrating the beginning of something faded from her face with the completeness of a light being switched off. She looked at herself in the mirror with an expression I had never seen on her before. Flat. Assessing. The expression of someone reviewing a completed task. She picked up her phone from the vanity. Her thumbs moved quickly across the screen. She set the phone down, looked at herself once more, and then composed her face back into something softer before turning toward the bedroom. I had seen it. The whole thing in the reflection lasting no more than 15 seconds. And I told myself I had imagined it. That was my first mistake of the marriage. It would not be my last. The first thing Eleanor did after we returned from our honeymoon in Cape Cod was ask me about Julian's debts. Not directly. Eleanor never did anything directly if she could accomplish it sideways. She asked over breakfast one morning in August while I was reading the financial section of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette whether I had spoken to Julian recently, whether he seemed well, whether the stress of his situation was something I worried about. She asked it with the tone of a woman who cared deeply and was simply making conversation the way you might ask about the weather or the neighbor's garden. "Julian is fine," I said, without looking up from the paper. "Of course," she said. She refilled my coffee without being asked and set the pot back on the warmer. I only ask because I ran into a mutual acquaintance last week who mentioned something about Atlantic City. I didn't want to bring it up, but I also didn't want to keep it from you. I put the paper down then. What about Atlantic City? Eleanor's expression arranged itself into something carefully compassionate, the look of a woman delivering difficult news. She wished she did not have to deliver. Apparently, the debt is larger than Julian has let on. Significantly larger. She paused. I thought you should know. As his father. What I did not know, what I would not learn until much later, was that Eleanor already knew the exact figure. She had known it for weeks. She had obtained it through means I still do not fully understand, and she had spent those weeks determining precisely how to use it. The debt was $180,000. Julian had accumulated it over 4 years across 3 different casinos, borrowing from one to pay another in the circular, desperate arithmetic of a gambling addiction. He was 32 years old, and he was drowning, and he had been too ashamed to tell me. Eleanor paid it off in full within 30 days of our conversation. She did it quietly, without telling me, and without telling Julian that she had done it without my knowledge. She let Julian believe it had been a joint decision, that I had known, that I had agreed, that my silence on the subject was the silence of a father who had chosen to help, without making his son feel worse than he already did. Julian called me that evening, his voice cracking with something between relief and shame that made my chest ache to hear. "Dad," he said. "I don't know what to say. I don't deserve this." I had no idea what he was talking about, but something in the rawness of his voice made me say, "You're my son, Julian. That's enough." After that phone call, Julian looked at Eleanor the way a drowning man looks at the person who pulled him from the water. And Eleanor, with the patience of someone who had planned this carefully, simply smiled and said it was what family did. She worked on Chloe differently. Chloe's weakness was not debt. It was the relentless, grinding awareness that she had married a man her father had never respected, and that the man in question did very little to earn respect from anyone. Derek Marsh was 34 years old and had held 7 jobs in the past decade, none of them for longer than 14 months. He was tall and well-dressed, and had a kind of surface charm that worked beautifully at dinner parties and evaporated entirely under any sustained examination. His handshake was the soft, uncommitted handshake of a man who had never built anything with his hands. When I looked at him across a dinner table, his eyes moved around the room in the habitual inventory of a person who is always calculating what things are worth, and whether there is a way to access that worth without doing the work to earn it. I had told Chloe none of this. She knew it. That was worse. Eleanor understood what Chloe needed better than I had ever bothered to learn. She complimented Derek at every opportunity, his ideas, his style, his potential. She gave Chloe expensive gifts with the casual generosity of someone for whom the cost genuinely did not register. And she defended Derek in my presence on the 2 occasions I could not hold my opinion entirely behind my teeth, stepping in smoothly with something like, "Arthur, I think Derek is still finding his footing. Some men need more time. That's not a flaw, it's just a different pace." Chloe looked at Eleanor after those moments the way she used to look at Margaret when Margaret defended her from my temper. That comparison, when it occurred to me later, turned my stomach completely. The dinner table changed. That is the most precise way I can describe what happened to my house in the 18 months after the wedding. The dinner table where Margaret and I had argued about business strategy and school decisions, and once memorably about whether a specific shade of blue was appropriate for the warehouse office walls. That table became a place where Eleanor sat at the center, and Julian and Chloe orbited around her, laughing at her stories, seeking her opinion, leaning toward her warmth. And I sat at the head of my own table, feeling like a guest who had not been formally invited. One Sunday evening in October of 2018, I watched Julian refill Eleanor's wine glass before she asked, watched Chloe show Eleanor photographs on her phone with the eager, hoping expression of a child wanting approval, and felt something move through my chest that I could not immediately name. It took me until I was lying awake at 2 a.m. to identify it. It was the particular grief of a man who realizes that the distance between himself and his children did not appear overnight. It had been growing for years quietly, and he had been too busy building a company to notice until someone else had stepped into the space he had left empty. Margaret had noticed. Margaret had always noticed. She had said to me once in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, when Julian was 19 and had not come home for Christmas, "Arthur, the company will still be there when you slow down. The boys won't be boys forever. I had kissed her on the forehead and gone into the office anyway. Now I sat in our bedroom, my bedroom at 2 in the morning, and the absence of her on the other side of the bed was a physical thing, a weight and a cold, and I missed her so fiercely that my eyes burned and my throat tightened until I had to press the back of my hand against my mouth to keep the sound from coming out. Downstairs I could hear Eleanor moving around the kitchen, making tea probably. She often made tea late at night. I lay there and thought about what Raymond had said in the parking garage. Remarkable is a performance. I told myself he was wrong. I told myself this was what rebuilding a family looked like, imperfect and uncomfortable and real. 6 months later, Eleanor told me she had been thinking about Marcus. Eleanor brought Marcus to dinner on a Saturday evening in January of 2019, 6 months after our wedding, presenting him the way a jeweler presents a particularly fine piece with confidence without fanfare, as though the quality spoke entirely for itself. He was 42 years old, and he was, I will admit, impressive in the way that certain things are impressive before you understand what they are made of. He was tall, well-built, with Eleanor's same gray eyes and a handshake that was firm without being aggressive, the handshake of a man who had been trained in the art of first impressions. He held an MBA from Harvard Business School and had spent 12 years in financial consulting across Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York. He spoke about market trends and structural steel supply chains with a fluency that made it easy to believe he had studied the industry specifically for this evening, which I would later understand was exactly what he had done. He's been consulting for mid-sized manufacturers for years. Eleanor said over the main course, her voice carrying the casual certainty of someone stating a fact rather than making a pitch. He's been looking for something with more substance, more permanence. I thought given everything happening with the board's concerns about succession planning, it might be worth a conversation. I looked at Marcus across the table. He met my gaze without flinching, and without overcorrecting, he did not look away, and he did not try too hard to hold the contact. It was a practiced balance, and it was good. What do you know about structural steel fabrication specifically? I asked him. Less than you, he said. More than most people you'd interview for the position. I'd rather prove it in the work than in this conversation. I appreciated the answer. That was the problem with Marcus. He always gave you the answer that was easiest to appreciate. The board approved his appointment as Deputy Chief Financial Officer in March of 2019, 9 votes to 2. Helen Vance was not on the board, but she was present in the room for the announcement, standing near the back wall with a legal pad in her arms, and an expression that I could not quite read at the time. After the meeting, she waited until the room had mostly cleared before approaching me. Mr. Calloway, she said. Helen had worked for Calloway Steel for 15 years, and she called me Mr. Calloway in professional settings, without exception, which I had always respected. May I ask, do you know Marcus Voss personally, outside of his relationship with Eleanor? I've met him several times now, I said. That's not quite what I asked, sir. Her voice was measured careful, the voice of a woman choosing every word with precision. I mean, independently, his professional references, his prior clients, whether you verified those directly. I told her the board's vetting process had been thorough. She nodded once and wrote something on her legal pad and said, "Of course. Thank you, sir." She walked back to her office and I watched her go with a vague unease I did not pursue. That evening I mentioned Helen's question to Eleanor. Eleanor set down her fork, pressed her lips together briefly, and then smiled with the patience of someone managing a minor inconvenience. "Helen is an excellent HR director," she said. "She's also been with the company long enough to feel territorial about changes in leadership. It's natural. It doesn't mean her instincts are correct." I accepted that. I should not have. Victor Hale joined the legal department 6 weeks after Marcus arriving with credentials from a firm in Philadelphia and a letter of recommendation from a federal judge Eleanor had apparently known for years. He was 45 precise and spoke in the careful hedged language of a corporate attorney who understood exactly how much each word was worth. He shook hands with everyone and remembered names on the first meeting, which people tend to find charming. Helen Vance noted his arrival in her records with a single line that I would not read until much later. 3rd senior hire in 90 days with direct connection to EV. Derek Marsh became Director of Operations in May of 2019, which was the appointment that should have stopped me entirely. I knew what Derek was. I had known for years. But Eleanor presented it so reasonably. Logistics experience, she said, a growing maturity in how he approached responsibility, the value of keeping things within a circle of trust during a period of transition. And I was in the middle of a quarter that was demanding every hour I had, and I told myself I would review his performance in 6 months and make adjustments if necessary. I did not make adjustments. I stopped being capable of making adjustments. The changes in my body began in the spring of 2019, subtle enough that I cataloged them as age rather than cause. My hands trembled slightly during the morning. Board briefings, I began keeping them below the table. I fell asleep at my desk on 3 separate occasions before noon, which I attributed to the schedule I was keeping. I missed a vendor call I had scheduled myself, and had no memory of missing it until my assistant mentioned it the following day. I did not connect these things to each other, not yet. What I did not know was that every morning in the master bathroom of our home on Devonshire Street, Eleanor opened my prescription bottle of amlodipine, the calcium channel blocker I had taken for blood pressure management for 11 years, and added a small measured amount of digoxin powder before replacing the lid. Digoxin is a cardiac medication derived from the foxglove plant used in controlled doses to regulate heart rhythm. In doses above the therapeutic range, it causes exactly the symptoms I was experiencing: fatigue, cognitive dulling, fine motor tremors, without producing results dramatic enough to trigger immediate medical investigation, particularly in a 64-year-old man with a history of cardiovascular monitoring whose physician was seeing numbers that appeared on the surface controlled. Eleanor had obtained the digoxin through Dr. Evans, who ran a private psychiatric facility outside the city, and who had been, for reasons I would only later fully understand, entirely at her disposal. She measured it carefully. She wasn't trying to kill me quickly. She was trying to make me small, gradually, plausibly, in a way that could be attributed to the natural deterioration of an aging man under professional stress. She stood at that bathroom mirror each morning and completed the task with the focused efficiency of someone performing routine maintenance. Then she would call down the hallway in the warm voice I had married, "Arthur, your coffee's getting cold." And I would come downstairs, drink my coffee, take my medication, kiss her cheek, and drive to the company that bore my name, growing a little smaller every day without knowing why. 3 months earlier, Eleanor had suggested I switch to a new internist, a younger doctor, she said with more current training in cardiovascular management. I had agreed without asking who referred him. I did not know until much later that the referral had come from Dr. Evans. Helen Vance noticed before I did. She began keeping a second set of records in a password-protected file on her personal laptop. Not because she could prove anything yet, but because 15 years of watching people move through an organization had given her a sense for the difference between natural change and engineered change. She documented every unusual hire, every shifted contract, every vendor relationship that had quietly changed hands since January. She put the records on a USB drive and kept it in the inner zip pocket of her work bag. She brought that bag to work every single day. The fog, when it came, did not announce itself. That is the thing I want people to understand about what Eleanor did to me. It was not dramatic. There was no single morning when I woke up and could not remember my name or failed to recognize my own reflection. It was quieter than that, and quieter is always more dangerous because quiet things do not trigger alarms. It began with meetings. I had run the Monday morning operations briefing at Callaway Steel every week for 31 years, without exception, through recessions, through the deaths of people I loved, through a February blizzard in 2010 that shut down half the city, and during which I had driven in on roads the municipal plows had not yet touched, because the briefing mattered and I was the one who had to run it. But in September of 2019, I missed it entirely. I woke up at my desk at 11:43 in the morning with no memory of sitting down. My coffee had gone cold beside the keyboard. The briefing had begun and ended, and the day had moved forward without me. And no one had knocked on my door to check, because Marcus had told my assistant that I had asked not to be disturbed. I learned this later. At the time, I simply sat at my desk with the cold coffee and a dull underwater feeling in my head that I could not shake, and I told myself I had been pushing too hard and needed to pace myself better. 3 weeks after that, my hands betrayed me in front of the full board. I was presenting the third quarter supplier review, a presentation I had prepared myself numbers. I knew as well as I knew my own address when my right hand began to tremble against the edge of the table. Not violently, just enough. Just enough for the man to my left, Gerald Whitmore, who had been on the Callaway steel board for 11 years, to glance down at my hand and then look away, with the carefully neutral expression of someone who has noticed something he wishes he had not. Marcus was on his feet before I had fully registered what was happening. He moved to the head of the presentation display with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment and had rehearsed his entrance carefully. "I can take it from here," he said. His voice was warm, concerned, the voice of a devoted stepson managing a difficult situation with grace. "Arthur, why don't you take a few minutes?" The board watched me, 12 faces arranged into various configurations of discomfort and sympathy, and something I did not want to name. Gerald Whitmore had stopped looking at my hand and was now looking at his legal pad. I wanted to stand up and tell Marcus to sit down. I wanted to finish the presentation I had prepared, deliver the numbers I knew, demonstrate to every person in that room that I was exactly who I had always been. Instead, what came out of my mouth was a sentence that trailed into nothing somewhere in the middle because the word I needed, procurement, a word I had used 10,000 times, simply was not there when I reached for it. Marcus finished the presentation. The board thanked him afterward with the particular warmth people reserve for someone who has handled an uncomfortable situation well. The board saw exactly what Marcus had arranged for them to see: an aging founder gradually stepping back and a capable deputy stepping forward to fill the space. It was a story they were already half prepared to believe because it was a story they had seen before in other companies with other men my age. I drove home that afternoon, gripping the steering wheel with both hands. My jaw so tight my back teeth ached, telling myself over and over that it was stress, that it was age, that it was nothing. Walter Gaines called me that evening. He had heard about the board meeting through the informal network of long-tenured employees that functions in every company as a kind of parallel communication system, faster and more accurate than any official channel. "Arthur," he said. His voice had the careful quality of a man walking on uncertain ground. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear it as coming from 30 years of friendship and not from anything else. Are you all right? And I mean that genuinely, not the answer you give people at the board table." My throat tightened. My eyes burned in a way I had not expected and did not welcome. "I'm working through something," I said. "I'll be fine, Walter." "Okay," he said. Then, after a pause that carried more meaning than most full sentences, "You know where I am." 2 weeks later, Marcus called Walter into his office and terminated his contract. "Cost restructuring," he said. "Streamlining vendor relationships," he said. Walter Gaines, who had built the first furnace in our original warehouse with his own hands in 1985, who had worked 11 months without a paycheck because he believed in what we were building, who had called me on the evening of my most humiliating board meeting to ask if I was genuinely all right. Walter was walked out of the Callaway steel facility by a man less than half his age with a Harvard MBA and no understanding of what the company had cost to build. I did not find out until 3 days later. 3 days. Marcus had told my assistant that I was aware of the decision and had approved it, which was a lie so casual and complete that it stunned me when I finally uncovered it, not because I was naive about what Marcus was, but because the confidence required to lie that directly to the people around me suggested a level of control over my environment that I had not fully understood he had achieved. I called Walter immediately. He answered on the first ring. "Walter, I need you to know that I did not approve that decision," I said. My voice came out harder than I intended, tight with an anger that had nowhere to go yet. I did not know. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Walter spoke, his voice was rough, in a way I had never heard from him before. Not angry, but something more unsettling than anger. Something that sounded like a man who had been bracing for a fall and had finally felt the ground give way. "I figured," he said quietly, "I figured that was the case, Arthur. I'm going to fix this," I said. "I know you are," he said. "Just be careful. Whatever is happening in there, be careful." Thomas Briggs, who had worked the furnace floor since 1991, was not terminated. Marcus needed the floor to keep running, but he was pulled from every internal committee he had served on and given a schedule that kept him away from anyone in a position to ask questions. Helen Vance lasted 11 more days after Walter. Marcus terminated her position on the grounds of redundancy in a restructured HR framework, a phrase that meant nothing and was designed to mean nothing, a bureaucratic wrapper around a decision that had been made for entirely different reasons. Helen had been documenting. Helen had been asking questions. Helen had been the institutional memory of 30 years of employment decisions, and institutional memory was the last thing Marcus wanted in that building. She cleaned out her desk on a Tuesday afternoon. One of the younger HR associates told me later that she had been entirely composed throughout that. She had packed her personal items into a single box, thanked the security officer by name, and walked out of the building with her bag over her shoulder and her head up. What no one saw was that inside that bag in the inner zip pocket was a USB drive containing every anomalous hire record, every shifted vendor contract, every documented irregularity she had cataloged over the previous 8 months. She went home, she made tea. She put the USB drive in the drawer of her bedside table and sat on the edge of her bed and cried, not from defeat, she would tell me much later, but from fury. Pure patient fury at what she had watched happen to something 30 years in the making. I was running out of people who could see clearly, and I was running out of time to notice. Thaddeus Gray knocked on my front door at 9 on a Tuesday evening in June of 2020, and the fact that he came to my home rather than my office, rather than through any official channel, told me everything about how dangerous he believed the situation had become before he said a single word. He was 48 years old and had run the quality assurance division of Callaway Steel for 20 years, with the meticulous, uncompromising standards of a man who understood that structural steel was not an abstract product. It went into bridges, it went into hospitals, it went into the buildings where people sent their children to school. Thaddeus Gray understood in his bones what failure meant. I brought him into the study and closed the door. He set a manila folder on my desk without preamble and opened it. The steel we've been supplying to the I-376 expansion project. He said, his voice low and controlled, but with an edge underneath it that I had never heard from him before, the edge of a man who had been sitting on something that frightened him. It's not ASTM-A36. ASTM-A36 is the American Society for Testing and Materials, standard for structural carbon steel, the federal benchmark that load-bearing steel must meet for use in public infrastructure. Every beam, every connection plate, every structural element in a bridge or public building is required to meet or exceed this standard. Below it, the math changes. Below it, the calculations engineers rely on become unreliable. Below it, things that are supposed to hold weight do not hold weight. How far below? I asked. Enough. Thaddeus pressed his finger against a lab report in the folder. I had samples tested independently. Yield strength is running approximately 35% under specification. The supplier Marcus brought in Consolidated Ridge Materials is billing us for A36 and delivering something significantly less. My hands were steady on the desk. That surprised me. My hands had been unreliable for months. But something about the clarity of what Thaddeus was telling me burned through the fog like a searchlight. How long? I asked. 8 months, maybe 9. His jaw was tight with the effort of keeping his voice even. Arthur, if those beams go into the I-376 expansion under load, we are talking about a public safety catastrophe, not a liability issue. People could die. I looked at the folder. I looked at the numbers. And for the first time in months, perhaps the first time since the fog had begun, I felt my mind working the way it used to work. Sharp, organized, certain. How many people know about this report? I asked. You and me, Thaddeus said. I didn't trust the internal channels, not with Marcus running procurement and Derek signing off on supplier approvals. I nodded. Leave the folder. Go home the back way, not through the main gate. Don't discuss this with anyone. Thaddeus picked up his coat from the chair. His hands were trembling slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the particular strain of carrying something enormous and finally setting it down. What are you going to do? He asked. I'm going to make some calls tonight, I said, and tomorrow I'm going to start fixing this. He was halfway to the door when Eleanor appeared at the study entrance, still dressed from dinner, a glass of sparkling water in her hand, her expression warm and mildly curious. Everything okay, gentlemen? She asked. I saw the light under the door. Thaddeus looked at me. I looked at Eleanor. Her eyes moved to the folder on my desk for exactly 1 second before returning to my face. Old business, I said, and I smiled at her. Thaddeus was just heading out. After I heard his car leave the driveway, I stood alone in the study. My heart was hammering against my ribs, not from panic, but from the cold, sudden clarity of understanding exactly what I was dealing with, and exactly how much time I did not have. I picked up the phone and called Frank DeLuca. "Frank," I said when he answered, "I need you to move faster, and I need you to install something in the master bathroom. Tomorrow, while Eleanor is at her charity luncheon, she leaves at 11 and doesn't come back before 2. That same night before I went to bed, I called a private bank on Fifth Avenue and gave them instructions about a safe deposit box and a name Eleanor had never heard me mention, a name that meant nothing to anyone in my world, except in the end, everything. The call came at 11:47 in the evening. I was still in the study, still at my desk, still turning over everything Thaddeus had told me, like a man sorting through wreckage trying to find what was salvageable. The phone rang, and the screen said, "Pennsylvania State Police," and my stomach dropped before I answered. "Mr. Calloway." The trooper's voice was the practiced, careful voice of someone trained to deliver bad news without making it worse. "This is Trooper Daniels out of the Pittsburgh Barracks. We have an incident on I-376 westbound involving a vehicle registered to a Thaddeus Gray. He's been transported to UPMC Presbyterian. Sir, it's serious." I was in my car before Eleanor reached the bottom of the stairs. She appeared in the doorway of the study just as I was pulling on my coat, her hair down, her expression arranged into something that looked like concern, the way a stage set looks like a room convincing until you look at the corners. "Arthur, what's happened?" she asked. "Thaddeus," I said. "Accident on I-376. "Oh no." She pressed her hand to her chest. Her voice was soft, appropriately distressed. "These things happen, Arthur. The roads at night, especially on the highway. Do you want me to come with you?" "No," I said. "Go back to bed." I did not look at her face when I said it. I was not ready to look at her face. UPMC Presbyterian was 40 minutes from the house at that hour. I drove the entire way with both hands on the wheel, and my jaw locked so tight that by the time I reached the parking garage, I had a headache spreading from my temples down into my neck. The radio was off. The car was quiet. I needed the quiet to think. Thaddeus was in surgery. A tractor-trailer traveling eastbound had crossed the median barrier on I-376 and struck his vehicle head-on. The trooper at the hospital told me the truck driver had walked away with minor injuries. Thaddeus had not walked anywhere. He was in a coma, and the neurosurgeon who came out to speak with me at 1 in the morning used phrases like significant intracranial pressure and guarded prognosis, which are the phrases doctors use when they are not yet willing to tell you the worst, but want you to prepare for it. Julian arrived 40 minutes after I did, which was notable because he lived 12 minutes from the hospital. He came in through the emergency entrance wearing a jacket over what looked like clothes he had been wearing all day, and his first question before he asked about Thaddeus, before he asked how I was directed at the nurse's station. "Was there anything recovered from the vehicle?" he asked. "Documents, a briefcase, anything like that?" The nurse told him she wouldn't have that information. Julian nodded and pulled out his phone and stepped away to make a call. My chest went cold. Chloe arrived 20 minutes later, genuinely distressed, her eyes red, her hands shaking as she gripped my arm and asked what had happened and whether Thaddeus was going to be all right. Whatever was happening around her, Chloe's fear in that moment was real, and I held her arm and told her we were waiting to find out. Derek Marsh stood near the vending machines at the end of the corridor, approximately 30 feet from where Chloe and I were standing. He was looking at his phone, thumbs moving in short, rapid bursts across the screen. When he became aware that I was watching him, he looked up. His thumbs stopped moving. He lowered the phone to his side. His expression shifted into something intended to resemble concern, but his eyes were doing something different from his face. They were calculating, moving between me and the exit and back again. The eyes of a man who is trying to determine how much of what he knows is visible from the outside. I held his gaze for 3 full seconds. He looked away first, and he looked away too quickly. I filed that away. The folder was gone. Trooper Daniels confirmed it when I asked no documents had been recovered from the vehicle or the surrounding scene. The manila folder that Thaddeus had carried to my house less than 24 hours ago. The lab reports the supplier records the chain of custody documentation he had assembled over weeks gone. I drove home at 2:30 in the morning. Eleanor was asleep or performing sleep with the same commitment she brought to everything else. I did not wake her. I went into the master bathroom and closed the door. I turned on the light above the vanity. I picked up my prescription bottle of amlodipine from the shelf where it always sat, and I held it under the light and I looked at it. The powder inside was white. It had always been white, But in the particular angle of the vanity light that I had not thought to use before, there was something in the color that was not quite right. Not wrong enough to be certain, just wrong enough to notice if you were looking for it, if your mind had finally stopped being foggy enough to look. I stood in that bathroom for a long time. Then I put the bottle back on the shelf, exactly where it had been, exactly the same angle. I went back to bed. I lay down beside Eleanor in the dark. I matched my breathing to hers slow, and even the breathing of a sleeping man. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, my mind was completely terribly clear. She had been patient. She had been thorough. She had built something around me so carefully that I had not seen it until I was standing inside it. But she had made one mistake that patient, thorough people sometimes make. She had assumed that because I was slowing down, I had stopped. I had not stopped. I thought about Margaret. I thought about her hand gripping mine in that hospital room with a strength I had not expected. And the last clear thing she had asked of me, not a request really, a charge. Something she had placed in my hands and trusted me to carry. "I hear you," I whispered into the dark. "I hear you." 3 weeks before the party, Eleanor set 2 documents on the kitchen table beside my morning coffee. "Just routine updates," she said, her voice carrying the breezy confidence of someone discussing a grocery list. "The estate attorney flagged them during the annual review. Your will hasn't been touched since Margaret, and the power of attorney language is outdated. It takes 20 minutes. It took less than 20 minutes. I was in the worst stretch of the digoxin's effects that month. My hands unsteady my concentration, sliding in and out like a radio signal in bad weather. I read the first page of each document, and I signed where she pointed. I have replayed that morning many times since. A Pennsylvania court would later classify what Eleanor did as undue influence, obtaining a legal signature from a person whose cognitive capacity had been deliberately compromised. The durable power of attorney she handed me transferred complete control of my financial and medical decisions to Eleanor in the event I became incapacitated. The updated will redirected 70% of my estate to Eleanor and Marcus. I signed both documents at my own kitchen table in my own handwriting on a Tuesday morning in August. She refilled my coffee afterward and asked what I wanted for dinner. The party itself was held on the 19th of September at the Fairmont, Pittsburgh. The grand ballroom, 200 guests, a string quartet. Playing in the corner, the kind of event that photographs beautifully and means nothing. I stood at the entrance and watched Pittsburgh's business community file in and shake my hand and tell me I looked wonderful. And I smiled and thanked them and thought about Frank DeLuca's camera in the master bathroom and the safe deposit box on Fifth Avenue and the name I had given the bank that Eleanor had never heard spoken in her presence. I had spent 3 months being careful, deliberately taking the digoxin each morning because stopping suddenly would change my behavior in ways Eleanor might notice, while Frank gathered footage and Raymond prepared the legal groundwork, and Sarah Mitchell, who did not yet know she was part of any of this, worked her night shifts at a facility 40 miles outside the city. Marcus checked his watch 3 times before 9 o'clock. Derek spent the cocktail hour near the exit nursing the same drink for 90 minutes. Eleanor was radiant, the red dress, the practiced smile, the warm hand on my arm every time someone important approached. At 10:15, she brought me a glass of champagne personally. The crystal caught the chandelier light as she extended it toward me, and she looked at me over the rim with those clear gray eyes and smiled the smile I had first seen at the Omni William Penn 3 years ago. I took the glass. "To 65 years, she said. "To 65 years, I said. I drank it because refusing would tell her I knew. And I was not ready, not quite yet, for her to know that I knew. Frank needed 4 more days. Raymond needed the weekend. The safe deposit box needed 1 more document that Sarah had not yet been asked to sign, because I had not yet told Sarah anything at all. So I drank the champagne. It was a calculated decision made clearly and deliberately by a man who understood exactly what he was trading and why. 40 minutes later, the room tilted. It came on faster than anything the digoxin had produced before, which told me Eleanor had added something additional to the champagne itself, something that interacted with 3 months of accumulated cardiac medication in ways she had likely discussed with Dr. Evans in the conversations Frank's recorder had been capturing for weeks. The left side of my body went first, then the language I reached for the word I needed to call out to the man standing 2 feet away from me, and it simply was not there the way a step is not there in the dark when you expect it. I went down, The last thing I saw clearly before the room closed in was Eleanor crouching beside me, her hand on my face, her eyes completely calm. "Someone call 911, she said to the room. Her voice was steady, concerned, perfect. And in the ambulance drifting in and out of consciousness with an oxygen mask over my face and the Pittsburgh streets moving past the small rear windows, I held on to one thought with everything I had left. Frank had the footage. Raymond had the contacts. The safe deposit box had the name. Hold on, I told myself. Just hold on. Before I tell you what Eleanor did the moment I was taken to that hospital, drop the number 65 in the comments right now. Just 65 my age, the birthday party that changed everything. It tells me you're still here, and I need to know that before I show you what happened next. Quick note: parts of this story include fictional elements built for meaning and reflection. If that's not something you'd like to continue with, this is a good place to step away, no judgment at all. I regained full consciousness on the morning of September 21st, 38 hours after the ambulance brought me into UPMC Presbyterian's emergency department. The left side of my body was weak but responsive. My speech had returned slower than usual, the words arriving with a half-second delay that was noticeable if you were paying attention. The neurologist, a precise woman named Dr. Harmon, told me I had experienced a transient ischemic attack, complicated by what appeared to be cardiac arrhythmia, a mini-stroke in plain language with a strong likelihood of full recovery, given my otherwise reasonable baseline health. Eleanor was sitting in the chair beside my bed when I opened my eyes. She had a manila folder on her lap. Not the same folder Thaddeus had brought to my house. A different one, thicker. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was warm and unhurried, the voice of a devoted wife who had spent 2 sleepless nights at her husband's bedside. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," I said. My voice came out rougher than I expected. "What's in the folder?" Eleanor, she opened it without hesitation, which told me she had been waiting for exactly this question. "Some paperwork the hospital's legal coordinator flagged," she said. "Given what happened, they need certain documents on file. Insurance authorizations, medical directives. Victor has already reviewed everything." Victor Hale arrived at the room 20 minutes later, his briefcase in hand, his expression carrying the measured gravity of a man performing an important service. He was my attorney of record as far as the hospital was concerned. Eleanor had ensured that months ago, quietly the way she ensured everything. Dr. Evans came in behind him. I had not met Dr. Evans before that morning. He was 50 years old, lean with the careful manner of a man who had learned to make authority look like kindness. He introduced himself as a psychiatric consultant brought in to assess cognitive function, following the neurological event standard procedure. He said in cases involving altered consciousness and suspected cardiac involvement affecting cerebral blood flow. He asked me 12 questions. Some of them I answered slowly because of the speech delay. One of them I answered incorrectly because I was watching Eleanor watch me, and I lost my concentration for a moment. He noted everything on a clipboard with the focused efficiency of a man who already knew what his report was going to say before he walked into the room. Eleanor asked Victor and Dr. Evans to step outside. Then she pulled her chair close to my bed and leaned forward with her elbows on her knees. And for one moment, one strange, disorienting moment, she looked almost like the woman I had met at the Omni William Penn. Almost like someone who cared. "Arthur," she said quietly, "I need you to understand that everything I'm doing is to protect you. The company, the assets, everything we've built together. While you're recovering, someone needs to be able to act. You know that." "What exactly are you filing for?" "Eleanor," I asked. She told me. Emergency temporary guardianship through the Pennsylvania Orphans Court. 2 medical certifications, Dr. Evans and a hospitalist on staff who had, as I later discovered, a gambling debt of his own that had found a quiet resolution sometime in the previous month. Victor Hale named as my guardian, ad litem, my legal representative in proceedings. I was not being told were happening. Judge Carol Simmons would review the petition that afternoon. Eleanor expected the temporary order within 48 hours. I looked at her. My speech was slow, and my left hand was weak, and there were 3 different monitors attached to my chest, measuring the rhythm of a heart that her patients had nearly stopped. And I looked at her, and I said as clearly as I could manage, "I don't consent to this, Eleanor." She smiled. It was the saddest smile I had ever seen, and it was entirely manufactured. "That's exactly what the certification addresses, sweetheart," she said. "The court doesn't require your consent when capacity is in question. That's the whole point of the process. She called Julian and Chloe separately. I heard Julian's voice in the hallway before he came in a low, urgent conversation with Eleanor that stopped when they reached the door. He walked in without meeting my eyes, sat down in the chair Eleanor had vacated, and stared at the monitoring equipment above my head. "Julian," I said. His jaw worked. His hands on his knees were pressing down so hard his knuckles had gone white. "Dad, He stopped, swallowed. "Eleanor said this is temporary, just until you're stable." "Look at me," I said. He looked at me. His eyes were red at the rims, and what I saw in them was not malice. It was the anguished, cornered expression of a man who had been handed a terrible choice and had not found the courage to refuse it. Eleanor had shown him the Atlantic City records, all of them, $340,000 in documented gambling debt, and the implied promise that one signature would make the exposure disappear. He signed. His hand was shaking so badly the pen scratched across the page, and he stood up immediately afterward and walked out of the room without another word. In the hallway, I heard him make a sound, a short, broken sound, quickly controlled, that told me more about my son in that moment than 30 years of watching him had. Chloe came in 10 minutes later, her eyes swollen, clutching her own elbows like she was trying to hold herself together. Eleanor had told her something different. She had told Chloe that the paperwork was to protect the estate from Julian's creditors, that Julian's debts posed a legal risk to the family assets, and that a temporary guardianship would create a protective buffer while Arthur recovered. Chloe had not read the documents carefully. Eleanor had known she would not. "Daddy," Chloe said, and her voice broke completely on the word, cracking open into something raw and young that I had not heard from her since she was a child. She grabbed my right hand with both of hers and held it against her face. "I just want you to get better. That's all I want." "I know," I told her, and I meant it. Whatever else was true, that part I believed. She signed. She wept through the entire thing, and she signed. The white van from Greenwood Psychiatric Center arrived the following afternoon. 2 orderlies and a nurse I had never seen. Victor Hale stood in the corridor with his hands clasped in front of him, watching the transfer with the careful neutrality of a man who had decided that what he did not acknowledge directly could not be said to trouble him. Eleanor walked beside the gurney to the hospital entrance. At the automatic doors, she bent close to my ear. Her perfume was the same perfume she had worn the night we met, a detail so deliberate it turned my blood cold. "Thank you for the kingdom, Arthur," she whispered. "Time to grow old in madness." The doors of the van closed. Through the small rear window as we pulled away from the hospital, I watched the Callaway Steel building appear briefly on the skyline between the older downtown towers, the steel and glass headquarters we had broken ground on in 2003 and opened 5 years later, the building Margaret had cried over in the parking lot on opening day because she said she still could not believe we had built something that tall. I made myself one promise in that van, watching that building disappear. I would walk back into it, on my own 2 feet, and I would take back every single thing that was mine. Greenwood Psychiatric Center smelled like industrial cleaner and other people's resignation. It was a small facility, 12 patients, a staff of 14, situated on 40 acres of wooded land, 40 miles outside Pittsburgh, where the cell signal was unreliable, and the nearest town was a 20-minute drive on a 2-lane road that no one used unless they were going to Greenwood specifically. Dr. Evans had built it that way, I would later understand. Isolation was not a side effect of the location. That was the point. My room had a window with a steel frame and reinforced glass that looked out over a stand of bare November oaks. There was a bed, a dresser, a chair bolted to the floor, and a small shelf where Dr. Evans's staff placed my medications 3 times daily in a paper cup with my name printed on a label in clean clinical type, Arthur Callaway, as if the name on the cup was sufficient proof that the person swallowing the contents deserved to be here. I had made my decision before the van doors opened on that first afternoon. I would give them exactly what they expected to see, nothing more, nothing less. I would be the confused, diminished old man the paperwork described, shuffling through mealtimes, staring at the wall during group sessions, responding to questions with the slow, searching look of someone whose thoughts had become unreliable. I would perform it completely, because halfway is always more dangerous than all the way. The medications went under my tongue and then into the toilet during the 40 seconds of privacy that the bathroom door provided. I had been doing it for 11 days before anyone noticed anything, and what they noticed was not that I was discarding the pills. It was that I seemed to be getting worse rather than better. which Dr. Evans noted in my chart as consistent with advanced neurological decline, and which suited my purposes entirely. At night after the hallway checks at 10 and again at 2, I lay in the dark and talk to Margaret, not out loud. I move my lips and push the words up from somewhere below speech the way you pray when you do not want anyone to hear you praying. Margaret, I said, I should have listened to Raymond. I should have been less lonely and more careful. And I should have asked more questions in the beginning when the questions were still easy to ask. But I am going to fix this. I promise you, I am going to fix this. On the worst nights, the nights when the oaks outside the window were black against a sky with no moon, and the facility was so quiet I could hear my own pulse, I pressed my face into the pillow and let myself feel the full weight of what had happened, the company, the children, the months of fog, and the morning I had signed documents on my own kitchen table without understanding what they said. I let myself feel it completely because I had learned a long time ago that the things you refuse to feel do not disappear. They wait. And they come back larger. Then I put it away, and I thought about the safe deposit box, and I went to sleep. Sarah Mitchell started her shift at 11 on a Thursday night in October. She was 28 years old, the newest member of the Greenwood night staff hired 8 weeks before my arrival through a standard healthcare recruitment agency. One of 3 new hires Dr. Evans had made that year, the only one he had not personally selected from a list Eleanor had provided. Sarah had slipped through the process the way honest things sometimes slip through systems built to exclude them unremarkably quietly on her own merits. She had her mother's photograph in her wallet, a small print worn soft at the corners from handling showing a woman in her 50s with Sarah's same dark eyes and a smile that had clearly required effort but had been given anyway. Her mother had died 3 years after a cardiac surgery that a charitable foundation had funded when her family could not afford the procedure. The foundation was the Callaway Community Health Initiative, established by Margaret in 2008, and administered by Arthur Callaway since Margaret's death. Sarah had recognized my face from a photograph in her mother's house, a newspaper clipping from 2011 showing the foundation's annual grant ceremony. Arthur Callaway shaking hands with the chief of cardiac surgery at Children's Hospital. Her mother had kept it on the refrigerator for 7 years. She did not approach me immediately. She watched me for 3 weeks first. The careful observation of a woman who had grown up with very little margin for error and had learned to be certain before she acted. She watched me shuffle through the breakfast line and stare at the wall during afternoon group. She watched my hands when I thought no one was looking, and my hands when I forgot to perform for 30 seconds at a time did not shake the way a man with stage 3 dementia's hands shake. They were still. They were waiting. On a Tuesday night in late October, she came into my room during her 2:30 check and stood at the foot of my bed. The hallway behind her was empty. The facility was as quiet as it ever got. "Mr. Callaway," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was steady, the voice of someone who had decided something and was not going back. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. My mother's name was Diane Mitchell. Your foundation paid for her heart surgery in 2011. She lived 3 more years because of that. She died anyway eventually, but she got 3 more years and she used every one of them." She reached into the pocket of her scrubs. She placed a small object on the blanket at the foot of my bed. A phone, a basic prepaid model, the kind you bought at a drugstore with cash. Beside it, a compact voice recorder, no larger than a thumb drive. "I can't do much," she said, her voice catching slightly before she steadied it. "But I can do this. Whatever you need to do, whoever you need to call you, should do it tonight. I start my rounds again at 3:15. She walked out of the room without looking back. I sat up in the dark. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. I picked up the phone and held it in both hands, and it took me a full 30 seconds to trust that it was real. Then I dialed the number I had kept in my memory for 40 years, through every change of address and every upgrade of technology, because Raymond Clark was the kind of man whose number you memorized and never forgot. It rang twice. "Raymond," I said when he picked up. There was a pause, a single breath, and then his voice came back to me across 40 miles of Pennsylvania countryside, steady as bedrock. "Arthur," he said, "tell me where you are." Raymond picked up on the second ring. 72 years old, retired for 6 years, and he answered at 2:30 in the morning like a man who had been sitting in his chair waiting for exactly this call. I told him everything. 20 minutes, no interruptions. The digoxin, the documents signed in August, the guardianship, Greenwood, Sarah. He listened the way Raymond always listened, completely without the small sounds people make to signal they are following, along without any reaction at all until I had finished. When I stopped, there was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds. "The safe deposit box," he said. "Tell me it's still intact." "It's intact," I said. "First National Private Bank, the Fifth Avenue branch in downtown Pittsburgh. Box registered under Sarah Mitchell's name. She has a signed authorization, notarized, legally binding, that I prepared and filed with the bank the morning after Thaddeus came to the house before I called Frank. I did not know who Sarah Mitchell was then. I only knew I needed a name Eleanor had never heard, and I asked Frank to find me someone connected to the company in a way that could not be traced back through Eleanor's network. He found Sarah's name in the Foundation's grant records from 2011. I signed the authorization without ever meeting her. Eleanor never knew the box existed. Raymond exhaled a long, controlled breath, the kind a man releases when he has been holding tension in his chest for weeks without realizing it. "All right," he said. "Tell me what's in it." I told him. 3 months before the party, the night after Thaddeus left my house, I had called Frank DeLuca and given him 2 instructions. The first was to accelerate his surveillance of Eleanor. The second was to install a camera in the master bathroom, a device no larger than a coat button, positioned inside the ventilation cover above the mirror, transmitting footage automatically to a private cloud server under Frank's account. Eleanor could search every drawer in the house and find nothing, because there was nothing in the house to find. The footage Frank had captured over the following 6 weeks was unambiguous. Eleanor every morning opening my amlodipine bottle, measuring a small amount of white powder from a folded paper packet, adding it to the bottle, replacing the cap. The timestamps ran across the bottom of each recording in clean digital type. The box also contained a USB drive. Frank had prepared financial records documenting Marcus's wire transfers through 3 shell companies registered in Delaware, totaling $8.7 million over 14 months. Invoices billed to Callaway Steel from companies that existed only on paper. Bank statements showing the money moving from those accounts into a holding account Eleanor controlled. There was a voice recorder file as well, a conversation between Eleanor and Dr. Evans captured by Frank's equipment during a meeting at Eleanor's home 3 months before the party. They discussed dosage adjustments. They discussed timing. Dr. Evans used the phrase managed deterioration, which is not a medical term. It is a strategy. And finally, there was a folder Frank had assembled on Eleanor's history. Richard Ashworth, Columbus, Ohio. Died April 2009. 2 years into his marriage to Eleanor, was listed as sudden cardiac failure. His estate, valued at just over $2 million, had transferred to Eleanor within 90 days of his death. The Columbus police had opened and closed an investigation in 2010. They had not had Frank DeLuca working the case. "Raymond," I said, "I need Sarah to go to the bank tomorrow morning. She has the authorization. Everything transfers to you. I'll have her contacted before 6, he said. Then, after a moment, "Arthur, they made one mistake. They went after a man who spent his entire life building things. Builders always leave a back door." "Margaret taught me that," I said. "I know she did." His voice was quiet. "Get some sleep. I'll handle the rest." I turned off the phone and held it in the dark. Through the window, the November oaks were still black shapes against a sky that had gone from black to the deep blue that comes just before morning. I thought about Julian. I thought about Chloe. I thought about what was coming for all of us and whether any of it could be undone or only endured. Then I thought about something Raymond had not mentioned, but that I knew was already turning in the back of his mind because Raymond had been a lawyer for 50 years, and lawyers of that caliber do not stop at what they can see. They look at the pattern. They ask what else fits the pattern. Richard Ashworth had fit the pattern. I put the phone under my mattress and lay back and looked at the ceiling. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. Sarah finishing her rounds, moving through the building with the quiet efficiency of someone doing necessary work in the dark. I closed my eyes. For the first time since September, I slept without dreaming. Arthur tells this part of the story the way it was told to him, later pieced together from what Julian said in a federal interview room in January of 2021, from what Chloe said to a victim's advocate 3 weeks after that, and from security footage that the FBI pulled from the Callaway Steel building during their investigation. He was not there, but the people who were there told the truth when it mattered, and the truth assembled itself into something he could follow. It was a Tuesday afternoon in November when Marcus gave the order about the photograph. He said it the way he said most things, casually between other agenda items, in a tone that suggested the decision had already been made and the conversation was merely administrative. He told the facility's coordinator that the portrait in the main lobby needed to come down. The woman in it was no longer relevant to the company's current leadership identity. A new photograph, Eleanor in the red dress in front of the Callaway Steel logo, had already been selected and framed and was waiting in the storage room on the second floor. Julian was crossing the lobby when the facility's crew began the work. He had been in the building for a meeting with Marcus about the quarterly distribution timeline, a meeting that had ended with Marcus explaining, with smooth and total confidence, that the distributions Julian had been promised from Eleanor's management of the estate would be delayed another 90 days due to what Marcus called liquidity restructuring. Julian had nodded and said he understood, and walked out of the conference room with his jaw tight and his hands in his coat pockets, and the particular hollow feeling of a man who has just understood with complete clarity that he has been lied to in a language he taught himself to speak. He was standing in the lobby when the crew lifted Margaret's portrait from the wall. It was the photograph Julian had grown up walking past every morning of every year he had worked in this building, his mother laughing at something off camera, his father looking not at the lens but at her the way Julian had only ever seen his father look at one person in his entire life. He had never stopped to think about what that expression meant. Standing there watching the crew wrap it in brown paper, he understood it completely for the first time. The crew wrapped the portrait in brown paper and carried it toward the service elevator. Julian stood there and watched it go. His chest felt like something was collapsing inside it, not dramatically. Not all at once, but the way a structure fails when the load exceeds what it was built to carry, slowly and then completely. He thought about the summer he was 9 years old when his father had let him ride in the cab of the delivery truck on a Saturday morning. He thought about his mother packing sandwiches in a paper bag and handing them through the truck window and telling him not to let his father forget to eat, because his father always forgot to eat when he was excited about something. He thought about how she had stood in the parking lot and waved until the truck turned out of sight, and how he had watched her through the side mirror, getting smaller and smaller, and felt with the absolute certainty of a 9-year-old that he was the luckiest person alive. He walked out of the building without going back upstairs. He did not tell Marcus he was leaving. He did not collect the documents from the conference room table. He walked to his car in the parking structure on the corner and sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes without starting the engine. Then he drove home. That same evening in the Callaway Steel executive suite on the 38th floor, Eleanor discovered what Marcus had been doing with the Cayman Islands account. It was not subtle once you knew where to look. Marcus had been routing money, not the full siphoned amount, but a significant portion, a personal reserve he had been building for 18 months, into an account she had not been told about, under a holding company name she did not recognize in a jurisdiction designed specifically to make money difficult to trace and impossible to freeze quickly. Eleanor found it because Eleanor always found things. That was the nature of the woman. She called Marcus into her office and closed the door. What followed was the only conversation between them in 2 years of collaboration that was not managed, not strategic, not performed. Eleanor's voice behind that door rose to a register her assistant had never heard from her before, tight and furious and stripped of every layer of practiced composure. "You are stealing from me, Marcus," she said. Marcus's response came back flat and clear through the door, the voice of a man who had been waiting for this moment with the same patience Eleanor had always claimed as her own. "I learned from the best," he said, "and I'm better at it than you think." Chloe was in the hallway. She had come up to speak with Eleanor about the delayed distributions, the same conversation Julian had already had downstairs, the same smooth lie about liquidity restructuring. She stood outside the closed door with her hand raised to knock and heard every word. She did not knock. She took the elevator back down to the lobby, walked past the bare wall where her mother's portrait had hung for 22 years, and sat down on a bench outside the building in the November cold and stared at the sidewalk and tried to organize what she knew into something she could act on. She was still sitting there when Julian texted her. Just 2 words. "Are you okay?" She looked at the message for a long time. Then she typed back, "No." "Are you?" His response took 4 minutes. Then, "Not really. Meet me for coffee, not here, somewhere else." They met at a diner in Squirrel Hill, a neighborhood diner with vinyl booths and fluorescent lighting, and the kind of coffee that nobody orders for the taste, and they sat across from each other for the first time in years, without Eleanor present, without Marcus present, without the managed social architecture that had governed every family gathering since 2018. Julian wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. His knuckles were red from the cold. "She's not going to give us anything," he said. "Marcus is taking it for himself, and Eleanor is losing control of it, and neither of them is going to give us a single dollar." Chloe stared into her coffee. "I signed papers at the hospital," she said. "Eleanor told me it was to protect Dad from your creditors." Her voice cracked on the last word, the crack of someone who has just heard themselves say something out loud that they have been avoiding hearing. "Julian, what did I sign?" Julian looked at her across the table. His eyes were red at the rims, and his jaw was working the way it did when he was trying to decide whether to say the true thing or the easier thing. He had been choosing the easier thing his entire adult life. "I don't know exactly," he said, "but I don't think it was what she said it was." Chloe pressed her fingers hard against her mouth. Her eyes filled and spilled over, and she wiped her face quickly with the back of her hand, angry at the tears, but unable to stop them. "Is Dad okay?" she asked. "Do we even know if Dad is okay?" "No," Julian said. His voice dropped to nearly nothing. "We don't know." He drove home alone at 11 that night. He sat at his kitchen table with his phone in his hand and the photograph of his parents in front of him, the same photograph from the lobby. Or rather the one he had kept in a drawer for years, the original print his mother had given him when he turned 21 with a note on the back that said simply, "This is where you come from. Don't forget it." He did not call Raymond Clark. He was not ready for that. He was not sure what ready felt like anymore. What he did instead was open a new message on his phone. He typed the number for Raymond Clark's office line, a number he had found in his father's old address book, the physical one leather-bound sitting in the kitchen drawer where it had always been. He typed it in carefully, digit by digit. Then he typed, "They are signing the sale, Friday, 40-floor boardroom, 10 a.m., don't let them." He stared at the message for a long time. His thumb hovered over the send button. His hand was shaking not from cold this time, but from the particular trembling of a person standing at the edge of something they cannot take back. He pressed send. Then he put the phone face down on the table, pressed both hands flat against the wood, and bent forward until his forehead touched the surface. His shoulders shook once, twice, and then he was crying ugly and raw, and without any of the composure he had spent his adult life constructing for his mother, for his father, for the 9-year-old boy in the cab of a delivery truck, who had genuinely believed he was the luckiest person alive. Raymond Clark's office phone rang at 11:52 p.m. The call went to voicemail. Raymond listened to it at 6. The following morning recognized the phrasing immediately. Julian had always written the way he talked, in short, declarative bursts with no qualifiers, and called the number back. Julian answered. There was a silence of 3 seconds, the silence of a man deciding, and then the line went dead. Raymond nodded to himself in the quiet of his kitchen. He picked up his own phone and dialed a number he had been keeping ready for 2 months. "Patricia," he said when Agent Cole answered. "It's Raymond Clark. We need to move. We have 40 hours. Raymond Clark had not practiced law in 6 years, but he had never stopped being a lawyer, which meant he had never stopped keeping records, never stopped maintaining contacts, and never stopped knowing exactly which phone call to make first, when something needed to be dismantled quickly and cleanly. He called Walter Gaines at 6:17 in the morning. Walter picked up before the second ring. "Raymond," he said, his voice already alert, already ready. The voice of a man who had not been sleeping deeply since the day Marcus walked him out of the Callaway Steel building. "Tell me what you need." "Everything you kept," Raymond said. "Every document, every record, every transaction you thought looked wrong and saved a copy of before they took your access. I need it in my office by noon." Walter arrived at 11:45 with a cardboard box and 2 colleagues, both former Callaway Steel employees, both terminated by Marcus within the same 90-day window, both carrying their own files. Between the 3 of them, they had documented 47 vendor contract changes, 23 supplier substitutions, and a complete paper trail of the Consolidated Ridge Materials relationship from its first invoice to its most recent delivery certification. the same certifications that had been filed with the Federal Infrastructure Oversight Office claiming ASTMA 36 compliance on steel that fell 35% below specification. That last item made Raymond set down his coffee cup very carefully. "This isn't just fraud," he said. "This is federal infrastructure endangerment. The I-376 expansion is a federally funded project. That changes the jurisdiction, and it changes the severity." Walter nodded. His jaw was tight. "I know," he said. "That's why I kept every copy I could get my hands on." Helen Vance arrived at 12:30. She had driven from her apartment in Mount Lebanon, 40 minutes in December traffic, with the USB drive in the inner pocket of her coat. The same coat Raymond noticed that she had been wearing when she walked out of the Callaway Steel building 4 months ago. She handed the drive to Raymond without ceremony. 15 months of documentation, she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with the particular intensity of someone who has been waiting a very long time to hand something over. Every anomalous hire, every shifted contract, every instance where the paper trail pointed somewhere it shouldn't. I cross-referenced everything against the original employee records from before Marcus arrived. The pattern is unambiguous. Raymond plugged the drive into his laptop. He scrolled for 90 seconds. Then he looked up at Helen and said, "You did remarkable work." Helen pressed her lips together and nodded once sharply, the nod of a woman accepting a compliment she had earned but did not need to dwell on. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we go to the FBI," Raymond said. Agent Patricia Cole ran the white-collar crime division of the FBI Pittsburgh field office. She was 44 years old, had spent 17 years in federal law enforcement, and had the particular quality of absolute stillness that some investigators develop after years of listening to people explain complicated things under pressure. She listened to Raymond's presentation, which ran to 90 minutes and covered the digoxin footage, the shell company wire transfers, the falsified medical certifications, the infrastructure steel fraud, and Frank DeLuca's complete surveillance package without interrupting once. When Raymond finished, she opened her laptop and began typing. "Richard Ashworth," she said, reading from a database query she had already run before the meeting. "Columbus, Ohio, died April 14, 2009. Cause of death, sudden cardiac failure. His estate valued at $2.1 million, transferred to his wife Eleanor within 90 days. Columbus PD opened an investigation in October 2010 and closed it 14 months later for insufficient evidence." She turned the laptop to face Raymond. "We've had a flag on Eleanor Voss's name in our system since 2011. The Columbus case never closed completely. It just ran out of momentum." Raymond looked at the screen. "It has momentum now," he said. Cole nodded. "I'm going to need 24 hours to process the evidence package and get the account freeze orders signed by a federal judge. I want them in place before 10 a.m. Friday so she can't move money the moment she realizes something is wrong." She closed the laptop. "Tell me about Thaddeus Gray." Raymond explained the email. The afternoon before the accident, Thaddeus had sent a fully encrypted data package lab reports chain of custody documentation for the steel samples. The complete technical file on the I-376 material substitution to a personal email account he maintained separately from his company address. The email had been sitting on a private server in Thaddeus's name since June. The FBI's digital forensics team would be able to retrieve it with a standard warrant within hours. Cole wrote something in her notebook. "If Gray is well enough to testify," she said, "this becomes significantly cleaner." "He opened his eyes yesterday afternoon," Raymond said. "I'm going to see him tonight." Cole stood and extended her hand. "Mr. Clark," she said, "tell Arthur Callaway that some of us have been waiting for a case like this for a long time." Raymond shook her hand. "He'll appreciate that," he said. "He's been waiting longer." He drove to UPMC Presbyterian that evening. Thaddeus was propped up in his hospital bed, the left side of his face still carrying the bruising from the accident, his left arm in a partial, cast an IV line running into his right wrist. He looked like a man who had been through something significant and had decided to be angry about it rather than diminished. When Raymond walked in, Thaddeus tried to sit up straighter and winced. "Don't," Raymond said, pulling the chair close. "You don't need to sit up for this conversation. You just need to listen and then tell me what you remember." Thaddeus looked at him steadily. I remember everything, he said. His voice was rough from the ventilator they had removed 4 days ago, but it was clear. I sent the file the afternoon before the accident. Every lab report, every chain of custody document, every communication I had with the independent testing lab. It's on my personal server. Password is Margaret1985. Arthur will understand why. Raymond's throat tightened. He wrote the password down carefully. One more thing, Thaddeus said. The truck driver who hit me. His name is on a cash payment record, $50,000 paid out of an LLC registered to a Derek Marsh 6 days before the accident. He reached toward the bedside table with his good hand and picked up a folded piece of paper. I had my daughter print this from my email this morning. It's the transfer confirmation. Raymond took the paper. He unfolded it. He read it twice. Derek Marsh, he said. Chloe doesn't know, Thaddeus said. His voice dropped slightly, carrying something that was not quite pity but was adjacent to it. I checked. She wasn't part of it. Raymond folded the paper and put it in his breast pocket. Get some rest, he said. You're going to need your strength on Friday. Thaddeus settled back against his pillow. Will Arthur be there? He asked. Yes, Raymond said. He'll be there. Thaddeus closed his eyes. The monitors above his bed beeped their steady rhythm. Raymond stood and buttoned his coat and walked out into the hospital corridor where the fluorescent lights hummed and the night shift was beginning its quiet rotation. He had 16 hours. Judge Carol Simmons had been on the Pennsylvania Orphans Court bench for 19 years. She had signed thousands of guardianship orders, temporary, permanent, contested, uncontested, and she had developed over those 19 years a precise and unforgiving instinct for the difference between a family trying to protect someone and a family trying to control someone. She read Raymond's emergency petition at 5 in the morning, alone in her chambers, with a cup of coffee going cold beside her elbow. And by page 12, her jaw had set in a way that her clerk who arrived at 5:30 recognized immediately as the expression Judge Simmons wore when someone had used her court to do something she found personally offensive. Raymond was shown into her chambers at 6. She did not offer pleasantries. She turned the petition to a marked page and pushed it across the desk toward him. Dr. Evans submitted a medical certification to this court, she said. Her voice was controlled, but the edges of it were sharp. A certification that formed the primary basis for my order. If what you are showing me is accurate, that certification was fabricated. It was, Raymond said. Victor Hale served as guardian ad litem. She said the words the way you say something that tastes wrong. He was simultaneously employed by the petitioner's legal team. He was, Raymond said. Judge Simmons picked up her pen. She signed the order, vacating the guardianship in 4 seconds. A signature that represented the most decisive 4 seconds of the entire case. Then she signed a second document. Arrest warrant for Dr. Evans, she said. Perjury and contempt. Get Victor Hale's Bar Association notified before noon. She looked up at Raymond over her reading glasses. Mr. Clark, tell Mr. Calloway that this court apologizes for the role it played in this, however unwillingly. Raymond folded both documents into his breast pocket. He'll understand, he said. He knows what unwilling looks like. The car reached the Greenwood facility at 6:41. Raymond waited at the entrance while the paperwork was processed 6 minutes that felt significantly longer, and then the main door opened and Arthur Calloway walked out. He was wearing the clothes he had arrived in 3 months ago, slacks, a collared shirt, a jacket that had been folded in a drawer long enough to carry permanent creases. He had a cane that one of the night staff had located somewhere in the facility's lost and found a wooden one, not his own. Raymond had brought a better one in the car, but did not mention it yet. Arthur stopped on the front step. The air was cold, sharp. December cold, the kind that arrives in Pittsburgh in the night and stays through the morning, and he breathed it in, slowly, deliberately, the way a person breathes when they have been in a place where the air did not feel entirely their own. Raymond stood at the bottom of the steps and did not speak. Some moments do not need managing. After perhaps 3 minutes, Arthur said, Sarah, she's been notified. Raymond said. She's safe. Evans won't be in a position to retaliate against anyone by this afternoon. Arthur nodded. He came down the steps, and Raymond handed him the dark wool overcoat he had brought from the office. Arthur put it on and straightened the collar, and for a moment he stood very still, with his hands at his sides, looking at the tree line at the edge of the property, where the December oak stood bare against a pale sky. Raymond Barrit, he said, how much time do we have? 16 hours until the signing, Raymond said. But first there's someone who asked specifically to see you before tomorrow. UPMC Presbyterian Room 417. Thaddeus was sitting up fully when they arrived, his left arm in its cast resting on the blanket. The bruising on his face faded to yellow at the edges. He looked up when Arthur walked in, and something moved across his face that was not quite relief and not quite pride, but carried the force of both. Arthur crossed the room in 4 strides and gripped Thaddeus's good hand with both of his, and his jaw was tight and his eyes were bright, and he did not trust his voice for a moment, so he did not use it. Thaddeus's own eyes were wet. "I kept the data," he said, his voice rough. "I knew you'd need it." "I know you did," Arthur said, his voice coming back steadier than he expected. "Password Margaret 1985. He pressed Thaddeus's hand once more hard. "She'd have liked that." Thaddeus laughed, a short, rough sound that cost him something physically, but that he produced anyway. "I figured," he said. "Are we going tomorrow?" "We are," Arthur said. Raymond stepped forward and placed a hand briefly on Thaddeus's shoulder. "You'll be there?" he said. "We arranged a wheelchair. You're not missing this." In the hospital parking lot, Raymond opened the car trunk and produced the suit charcoal black freshly pressed hanging in a garment bag. He handed it to Arthur without ceremony. Arthur took it. He held the garment bag in both hands and looked at it for a moment. "Raymond," he said, "thank you for all of it." Raymond waved the thanks away in the manner of a man who found gratitude for doing the obvious thing slightly embarrassing. "Get in the car, Arthur," he said. "We have work to do." Raymond had arranged a room at the Omni William Penn, the same hotel where Arthur had met Eleanor at the charity gala 3 years ago. Raymond had not chosen it for the symbolism. He had chosen it because it was 4 blocks from the Callaway Steel Building and had a parking structure that allowed for discreet arrivals. But when Arthur walked into the lobby and recognized the gilded ceiling and the chandeliers Margaret had called aggressively optimistic, he stood still for a moment and felt the particular weight of circles closing. The room was on the 14th floor, facing east toward the Monongahela. Raymond had left a change of clothes, a toiletry bag, and a yellow legal pad on the desk, with a note that said, "Write down anything you want to say tomorrow. You don't have to use it, just get it out of your head." Arthur showered for 20 minutes. He stood under the hot water and let it run until the cold that had settled into his bones at Greenwood, 3 months of institutional chill. The cold of rooms that were kept at a temperature designed for management rather than comfort began to loosen and release. He pressed his palms flat against the tile and dropped his head forward and breathed. He did not cry. He had done that in the dark of his room at Greenwood, on the nights when the oaks outside the window were black and the building was quiet and there was nothing between him and the full weight of what had happened. He had let himself feel it completely, and then he had put it away. There was nothing left to cry tonight. Tonight required something different. He dried off and dressed in the clothes Raymond had left, dark slacks, a white shirt, the charcoal black suit jacket, and sat at the desk. He uncapped the pen. He looked at the legal pad. He wrote Margaret's name at the top of the page. Then he sat for a while and thought about everything she had built and everything she had carried, and the morning she had handed back his business plan with her red pen marks and said it was good enough to bet on. He thought about the way she had stood in the parking lot waving until the delivery truck turned out of sight. He thought about 8 months of cancer and the grip of her hand on his in the hospital room, and the last clear thing she had said to him, her last words to him, the promise he had made and had nearly broken completely. He had almost let them take both. He thought about Julian, the text message Raymond had described, the anonymous number, the short declarative sentences, the 3-second silence on the phone before the line went dead. Julian, who had spent his adult life choosing the easier thing, had chosen the harder thing exactly once at exactly the moment it mattered. Arthur did not know yet what that meant for everything else, for the debt, for the years of absence, for the signed document in the hospital room. But he knew what it meant for tomorrow. Julian had given them 40 hours. That was real, whatever else was true. He thought about Chloe, sitting on the bench outside the Callaway Steel Building in the November cold, reading the document she had signed, understanding for the first time what she had put her name to. He thought about Derek Marsh and the $50,000 and the truck and Thaddeus's 8 months in that hospital bed, and he thought about the fact that Chloe had not known. Thaddeus had checked. She had not known. That did not undo the signature, but it changed what the signature meant. He wrote for an hour, not a speech. He had never given a speech in his life that he had written down first, because the written version was always smaller than what he actually needed to say. He wrote notes, fragments, things he wanted to remember, to feel rather than say. The name Thomas Briggs, who had touched his arm in the hallway. The name Walter Gaines, who had answered the phone at 6 in the morning without being asked why. The name Helen Vance, who had walked out of a building with a USB drive in her coat pocket and kept it in her bedside drawer for 4 months, because she had believed without any evidence that she was right, that eventually someone would come asking for it. He wrote Sarah Mitchell. He put a small star beside her name. He wrote Raymond Clark. He put nothing beside it because nothing was sufficient. At 11:30, he closed the legal pad and stood and walked to the window. Pittsburgh spread out below him in its nighttime configuration, the bridges lit across the rivers, the stadium dark on the North Shore, the Callaway Steel Building visible 4 blocks away with its upper floors still lit against the December sky. The lights up there burned all night. Marcus had begun that practice 6 months ago. Arthur had been told keeping the executive floors illuminated around the clock as a kind of territorial display. The building glowing in the dark like something that had been claimed. Not for much longer. Arthur placed his hand flat against the cold glass of the window. He could feel the December air on the other side pressing back. "Margaret?" he said, not in his head this time, out loud quietly to the city and the night and the lit building 4 blocks away. "I almost let them take it. I'm sorry for that. But I kept my promise. You'll see." He stood at the window for a long time. The city moved below him, a late bus on Grant Street, the red and white lights of the highway interchange in the distance, the river catching the bridge lights in long, broken reflections. Then he went to bed. He set the alarm for 5:30. He closed his eyes. He thought about the look on Eleanor's face when she had seen him in the doorway of the boardroom. In his dream of this moment, the look he had imagined 100 times, in the dark of Greenwood lying on his back, with the ceiling above him and the oaks outside the window, and Sarah's footsteps moving down the hall. Tomorrow, it would not be a dream. He slept. Before I walk you through what happened, when those boardroom doors opened, comment justice below, so I know you made it this far. Because what Eleanor and Marcus saw when they turned around that morning, I have been waiting to tell you this part for the entire story. A reminder, this story contains fictional elements crafted to carry a lesson worth hearing. Names, places, and some details are imaginary. But if this kind of storytelling isn't for you, you're free to step away here, and I respect that completely. I arrived at the Callaway Steel Building at 9:45. Raymond pulled the car to the curb on 5th Avenue, and I stepped out onto the sidewalk and stood for a moment, looking up at the building. 37 years. The original warehouse on the south side had been a single story with a leaking roof. This building was 40 floors of steel and glass that Margaret and I had broken ground on together in 2003, and it rose above the Pittsburgh morning sky, the way things rise when they have been built carefully and meant to last. I went inside. The lobby guard, a young man I did not recognize, one of the replacements Marcus had cycled through in the past year, looked up from his desk and opened his mouth. Then he looked at me more carefully. Then he closed his mouth and nodded. The elevator opened on the 40th floor, and I stepped out into the hallway. Walter was there. He was standing near the window at the far end with his arms crossed, wearing the gray work jacket he had worn the day Marcus fired him. When he saw me, his jaw tightened and his eyes went bright and wet, and he pressed his lips together hard. He did not look away. Helen Vance was beside him, her posture straight, and composed, her eyes red at the rims in a way that no composure could fully conceal. She had been crying before I arrived. She pressed one hand flat against her sternum when she saw me, as though she needed something to hold on to. Thomas Briggs was there 30 years at the furnace burn scars on his left forearm. The kind of man who shows up when showing up is the only thing left to do. As I passed him, he reached out and touched my arm just above the elbow. His eyes were wet, and he did not try to hide it. I stopped. I looked at him. My throat was too tight for words, so I put my hand briefly over his and kept moving. A dozen others lined the hall. People I had worked with for 20 years, 30 years. People Marcus had terminated or sidelined, or simply made unwelcome in a building they had given their working lives to. They did not cheer. They did not speak. They stood and watched me walk toward the boardroom door. And the weight of that, the accumulated weight of every year they had given, and every indignity they had absorbed, and every morning they had still shown up pressed against my chest, until I had to breathe through it deliberately, the way you breathe through something that would otherwise stop you. I put my hand on the boardroom door. I pushed it open. The room was exactly as it had been 3 hours ago. In my imagination, the long mahogany table, the leather folders, the contract document positioned in the center, with 2 pens laid side by side, the Pittsburgh skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The representative from Hargrove Capital sat at the far end with his briefcase open, and the particular expression of a man who had been told this was a formality. Eleanor was standing near the window in the red dress. Marcus was beside her, his hand on the back of a chair, his posture arranged into the easy authority he had been practicing for 2 years. Eleanor turned first. The color drained from her face with a completeness that I had only seen once before, the night in the hospital, when I had told her I did not consent to the guardianship, and she had smiled anyway. But there was no smile now. Her hand reached back and found the edge of the table and gripped it, and her knuckles went white and the red dress seemed suddenly like a costume rather than a choice. Marcus turned a half-second behind her. The pen he had been holding hit the mahogany table and rolled to the edge and fell. The Hargrove Capital representative looked between us with the expression of a man who has just understood that he is in the wrong room for what is about to happen. I walked to the head of the table. I set my cane against the arm of the chairman's chair. I sat down in the chair that had my name on the building outside. I said, that someone was selling my company. Eleanor's mouth opened. Nothing came out. For a woman who had spent 3 years never being without the right words, the absence of them seemed to physically hurt her, her throat working her jaw, moving nothing, arriving. Marcus straightened. He opened his mouth to say something that would have been careful and plausible and wrong, because Marcus always had something careful and plausible and wrong ready to say. Raymond stepped forward and nodded toward the audio-visual panel. The screen behind me, which had been loaded with the Hargrove Capital acquisition presentation, 64 slides about synergies and market positioning and projected returns, went dark for 2 seconds. Then it came back. The first image was a timestamp, December 14th through March 22nd, 114 mornings. Eleanor at the bathroom vanity, her back to the camera, her movements precise and unhurried. A small paper packet and a prescription bottle, and the same ritual performed with the efficiency of someone who had decided long ago that what they were doing was simply necessary. Eleanor made a sound. It was not a word. The second image was a waveform audio, and then Agent Cole pressed play, and the room filled with Eleanor's voice and Dr. Evans's voice, discussing managed deterioration and dosage adjustment and the timeline for the guardianship filing, recorded in Eleanor's own living room 3 months before the birthday party. The third image was a spreadsheet. $8.7 million, 41 transfers, 33 shell companies. The name Marcus Voss appearing on the authorization line of each transaction. Marcus looked at the spreadsheet for 4 seconds. Then he looked at Eleanor. Then he looked at Agent Cole, who had entered through the side door, with 6 agents in dark jackets, and he made a calculation that took him perhaps 2 more seconds. "I want a cooperation agreement," he said. His voice was entirely steady. "I'll give you Eleanor. I'll give you Ohio. I'll give you all of it." Eleanor turned toward her son. What happened to her face in that moment was not grief and not fury, but something beneath both of them, the raw, stripped expression of a person who has just watched the last wall come down. She had built everything on the assumption that Marcus's loyalty to her was absolute because she had made him and she had taught him and she had believed in the way that certain people believe in the things they have created, that he was finally and completely hers. He was not hers. He had learned from her. That was different. "Marcus," she said. Her voice cracked on his name. The only time in 3 years I had heard Eleanor's voice crack on anything. "Marcus, you do not—" "Mrs. Voss," Agent Cole said, moving to Eleanor's side. "Please keep your hands where I can see them." The handcuffs made a sound that the room would remember. Eleanor stood with her wrists bound behind her back in the red dress she had chosen for the day she completed her takeover of Callaway's Steel. And she looked at Marcus, who was already speaking quietly with one of Cole's agents, and her face went through something I did not have a name for, and have not found one since. Dr. Evans had been arrested at Greenwood at 7 that morning. Victor Hale had been taken from his home in Fox Chapel at 7:15. At 11:04, airport security at Pittsburgh International detained Derek Marsh at gate C-17, attempting to board a flight to Cancun with 2 carry-on bags and a one-way ticket, purchased 48 hours earlier. He was crying when they put the handcuffs on him, not from remorse, Trooper Daniels told me later, but from the specific degraded desperation of a man who has just understood that he is not going to get away. I thought about Chloe when I heard that. I thought about the November bench outside the building, and the document she had finally read, and the text she had sent Julian. No. Are you? I thought about what it meant to find out the person you had built your life around was capable of something like that. And I thought about the particular loneliness of learning it publicly all at once with no preparation and no exit. Julian and Chloe were standing in the corner of the boardroom near the window. Julian had his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes on the floor, his jaw moving the way it did when he was trying to hold something in. Chloe was gripping her own elbows, her face pale, her eyes moving between Eleanor being led from the room and the floor, and me landing on me and then quickly away as though direct contact was more than she could manage. I walked to them. Julian looked up. His eyes were red and raw, and he looked in that moment younger than he had looked in years, stripped of the performance of adulthood down to something more honest and more afraid. "You sent the message," I said. "Dad." His voice broke on the word. He pressed his lips together and tried again. "Dad, I'm sorry. I know that's not—" He stopped. His hands came out of his pockets and he pressed them flat against his thighs, the gesture of a man trying to physically hold himself together. "I know sorry doesn't cover it." "No," I said. "It doesn't." I looked at my son, at the 38-year-old man standing in front of me, who still looked when the composure came down like the 9-year-old boy in the cab of a delivery truck who had believed he was the luckiest person alive. "But you sent the message. The court will know that. And I will know that. Those are two different things, and they both matter." Julian's chin dropped to his chest. His shoulders shook once hard before he brought them back under control. I turned to Chloe. Her eyes filled, immediately spilling over before she could stop them. "Your husband ordered the truck that put Thaddeus in a hospital bed for 8 months. I said, I kept my voice even because she needed me to keep my voice even. You did not know that. Thaddeus checked. He told me himself. You did not know." Chloe's breath came out in a sound that was almost inaudible, a small, devastated exhale that carried everything she did not have words for. "But you signed the documents," I said, "and you will have to live with that. Not the legal consequences Eleanor constructed it, so the liability falls on her. But you will have to live with knowing what you did and what it meant. That's a different kind of weight, and I can't carry it for you." "Daddy," she whispered. One word. The same word she had said in the hospital room, and it broke in exactly the same place. "You are my children," I said. "Both of you. You were cowards when it mattered most, and that is also true. Both things exist at the same time, and neither one cancels the other. I need you to understand that." Julian nodded. He could not speak. "Now go home," I said. "Don't talk to the press. Call the lawyers Raymond recommends. And call me in a week when some of this has settled." I left them at the window and walked back to the head of the table. The Hargrove Capital representative had gathered his briefcase and was making his way toward the exit with the dignified haste of a man who wants to be somewhere else and has the good sense to accomplish it quietly. The board members who had been present for the signing were still in their seats, most of them watching the room with the stunned alertness of people who had come for a routine transaction and received something else entirely. I looked at Gerald Whitmore, the same man who had looked away from my shaking hands at the board meeting 14 months ago. "Gerald," I said, "I'd like to call a board vote, rescinding the sale agreement with Hargrove Capital and reinstating the previous operational structure pending a full audit. Do I have a second?" Gerald Whitmore, who had served on the Callaway Steel Board for 11 years and who understood perhaps better than anyone else in that room the full weight of what had just happened, straightened in his chair and said, "Seconded." The vote was unanimous. I sat at the head of the table and looked out at Pittsburgh through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The Monongahela was catching the December light, the way it always did, broken and bright, moving in the cold. The bridges stood where they always stood. The city was exactly where it had always been. Raymond came and stood beside my chair. He did not say anything. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder and then removed it, which was the Raymond Clark version of everything. Thaddeus, in his wheelchair near the door, caught my eye across the room. His face was tired and bruised and more alive than I had seen it in months, and he nodded once, a single definitive nod that said what it needed to say without requiring a single word to say it. I nodded back. Then I picked up the 2 pens from the contract document in the center of the table, The pens Eleanor and Marcus had set out for the signing that was supposed to end everything I had built, and I held them for a moment. Then I set them down at the far edge of the table, side by side, facing away from me. We were done with those. 6 months is not a long time, but it is long enough to learn with a clarity that shorter periods do not allow exactly who belongs in something you gave your life to. Eleanor Voss was sentenced in April of 2021 in the Federal District Court for the Western District of Pennsylvania. 23 years, no parole for the first 15. The charges covered racketeering under the RICO statute, wire fraud, unlawful imprisonment, and federal conspiracy charges in connection with the death of Richard Ashworth in Columbus, Ohio, in 2009. Charges made possible under federal jurisdiction because the financial crimes in the Ohio case formed part of the same pattern of racketeering conduct. The Columbus investigators had run out of momentum on that case 12 years earlier. They did not run out of momentum this time. She walked into that courtroom in a gray suit. Not the red dress, not the practiced smile, just a woman in a gray suit who had built something elaborate and terrible and watched it disassemble in a single morning. When the sentence was read, she looked at the wall above the judge's head, and her face was entirely still. She did not look at me. I had spent 3 years looking at her face. I did not need to see it anymore. Marcus received 11 years after his cooperation agreement, plus full restitution of the $8.7 million. Every asset liquidated the debt, following him out whenever he was released. His testimony closed not just our case, but 2 additional fraud investigations in Philadelphia and New York. He was thorough and accurate and entirely without sentiment, which was, I thought, the most honest version of Marcus anyone had ever seen. Dr. Evans lost his medical license and received 8 years. Victor Hale was disbarred and received 5. Derek Marsh received 15 years, the maximum, and the judge noted during sentencing that the premeditation and the severity of harm to Thaddeus Gray warranted no leniency whatsoever. He was crying when they took him from the courtroom, not from remorse, from the specific cornered desperation of a man who has finally understood he is not going to get away. Chloe was not charged. Eleanor had structured the hospital documents to hold all liability herself. Whether that was strategy or something else, I could not say. Chloe filed for divorce the week after the arrests, moved to a small apartment in Shadyside, and began the slow, unglamorous work of starting over. She calls on Sundays sometimes. We talk about small things. I think that is exactly right for now. Julian avoided criminal charges through his cooperation. He gave up any claim to the estate without contesting it, which I had not asked him to do. He is working at a machine shop in the Hill District. He called me on a Tuesday morning in May, and we talked for 20 minutes, and at the end he said, "Dad, I know this doesn't fix anything." I told him I knew he knew that. I told him to call again sometime. Whether he does is his to decide. The board voted unanimously in January to appoint Thaddeus Gray as Chief Executive Officer. He walked into his first board meeting without the wheelchair. He had insisted on that, the physical therapy, the stubbornness, the refusal to let the first impression be anything other than what he intended it to be. He sat at the head of the table and looked at the room and said, "I intend to run this company the way it was built, on merit, on quality, and on the people inside it. If anyone here has a problem with that, say so now." No one said anything. Callaway Steel posted its strongest first quarter in company history in March. The inflated vendor costs dropped almost immediately. The I-376 expansion was halted, the substandard steel removed and replaced, and the project restarted 4 months later with material that met every specification. No one was hurt. I think about that often. Helen Vance came back as Vice President of People and Culture. She brought a plant for her office on her first day, a large, healthy fern that she placed on the windowsill with the air of someone reclaiming exactly what was always hers. Walter Gaines signed a 10-year supply contract in February, the longest we had ever offered. He signed it in my office, and when it was done, he looked up and said, "Margaret would have liked this." I said, "She would have said it was overdue." Walter laughed. It was the best sound I had heard in a long time. Sarah Mitchell enrolled in the nursing program at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine in September, funded by the Callaway Community Health Initiative. We renamed the education fund the Margaret Callaway Education Fund, which the board approved without discussion. On the 15th of June, I stood on the balcony of the 40th floor and looked at Pittsburgh in the evening light. The Monongahela was running high copper-colored in the late sun. The bridges stood where they always stood. I held a photograph Margaret and I outside the warehouse on a Saturday morning in 1991, laughing at something neither of us would remember later. We were very young. We did not know it at the time. We made it, I said, out loud to the river and the city and the evening. The company is with the right people. Thaddeus, Helen, Walter, Sarah. You would have liked her. She has your way of deciding something and then doing it without ceremony. I paused. Julian called last week, I said. I don't know yet what that becomes. Chloe is finding her way. They're yours as much as mine, even when it's difficult to feel that, especially then. I put the photograph in my breast pocket. You told me not to let them take what we built, I said. I almost did. I want you to know that I understand how close it was. But I kept the promise, late and with a great deal of help. But I kept it. The river moved, the light changed. The building behind me stood 40 floors against the Pittsburgh sky, lit from inside. I went back in. There was work to do. There always had been. And I was after everything still the right person to do it. To anyone listening, do not underestimate a man who built something from nothing. Age slows the body. It only sharpens the one thing that matters, the ability to see people for exactly who they are. The old wolf does not growl. He waits. And when the moment comes, after all the patience and all the dark and all the long nights of keeping promises to people who can no longer hear them, he does not miss. If this family story taught me anything, it is this: loneliness is not a weakness. But letting loneliness make your decisions for you, that is where the danger lives. I trusted the wrong person because I stopped trusting myself. Do not make that mistake. Do not be like me. I have lived long enough to know that family betrayal cuts deeper than any business loss, any financial wound, any public humiliation. What Eleanor took from me was not the company. It was years I cannot recover. I believe God kept me breathing in that place so I could walk back out and finish what Margaret and I started together. I am grateful for that, every single day. This family story ends with the right people in the right places. But not every story does. Some family betrayal never gets corrected. Some wolves never come home. That is the truth I want you to carry with you. Protect what you build and protect the people who help you build it. If this story moves something in you, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, so you never miss another story like this one, thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and the lessons they carry. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. Choose what serves your heart best.